Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a conversation with Randy Hutter Epstein and Chelsea Clinton. My name is Anna Reisman. I run the program for Humanities in Medicine here at Yale Medical School, and I'm thrilled to be able to put on this special event today, which is our first of our lecture series. I will tell you a little bit about Randy and Chelsea and then turn it over to them to converse, and we will listen in. So Randy Hutter Epstein is a medical writer, a lecturer at Yale's English department, an adjunct professor at Columbia School of Journalism, and most importantly, writer in residence here at Yale Medical School. She has worked as a medical writer for the London Bureau of the AP, was the London Bureau Chief of Physicians Weekly. Her articles have appeared in many, many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, among many, many other newspapers and magazines. Randy's first book was entitled Get Me Out, A History of Childbirth from the Garden of Eden to the Sperm Bank. In this book, she takes the reader through history, fads, and fables, and to the fringe of science, where audacious researchers have gone to extreme measures to get healthy babies out of mothers. Her most recent book, published this summer, is entitled Aroused, The History of Hormones and How They Control Just About Everything. The book tackles the strange science of hormones and the age-old quest to control them. Her subjects, and you'll hear a lot more about this, range from leading scientists who make life-changing discoveries about hormone imbalances to charlatans who use those discoveries to peddle false remedies. Randy earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania, an MS from the Columbia School of Journalism, and an MD from the Yale School of Medicine, and an MPH from the Columbia School of Public Health. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you.
Chelsea Clinton is vice chair of the Clinton Foundation, where she helps create opportunities for people, families, and communities to build better futures. She is an advocate for expanding access to early childhood education and providing the next generation of young leaders with resources they need to turn their ideas into action. She is especially interested in empowering girls and women, which seems especially appropriate to mention today. Chelsea currently teaches at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health and previously worked at McKinsey & Company and Avenue Capital. She holds a BA from Stanford, an MPH from Columbia's School of Public Health, and both a Master of Philosophy and a doctorate in International Relations from Oxford University. Chelsea is the author of 4 books. With Devi Sridhar, she co-authored Governing Global Health, Who Runs the World and Why, which examines the role of public-private partnerships in combating the spread of infectious diseases like AIDS and reducing pervasive chronic health problems like malnutrition. She authored a book for readers aged 10 to 14 called It's Your World, Get Informed, Get Inspired, and Get Going. And she's also written 2 picture books called She Persisted, 13 American Women Who Changed the World, and the companion, She Persisted Around the World. These introduce tiny feminists, mini activists, and little kids who are ready to take on the world to 13 inspirational women who never took no for an answer and who always, inevitably and without fail, persisted. Yes. Welcome, Chelsea.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Anna, for that introduction. Thank you to Yale and to the medical school in particular for hosting us today. I always love the chance to talk with my good friend Randy. I always learn a lot from her. And I think as the conversation progresses this afternoon, you'll understand why. Although I was lucky enough to get an advance copy of Aroused, I reread it over the last couple of days in anticipation of our time together here, and just was again reminded both by how much kind of we've learned about our hormones over the last century and how much we still don't know. So I hope that we can both probe kind of what we know and what we don't here today. I will shamelessly exploit my position in this chair to ask questions for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up to all of you to ask whatever questions you may have of Randy, or if you want to ask me a question, I'm happy to at least entertain it. Won't promise I'll answer it, but I'm happy to listen. But to arouse, one of the things, Randy, that we've talked a lot about in the context of Aroused and your other work, is that medicine and the health sciences broadly don't exist in isolation, kind of from their broader cultural, social, and political contexts. And one of the things I think you do a really excellent job of in Aroused is teasing out particularly how culture has influenced kind of what questions were asked, what research was done, and also what wasn't done kind of in the study of hormones. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and I think that's the way I framed the book too. I don't cover every hormone, there's a lot, or everything that's gone on, but I like to look at each decade or each time period and think, what does this say about the culture? Not so much what does this say about an advance, but what does this say about what's going on? So the 1920s, for instance, 1920s into the early 1930s, we were very curious. What are the ovaries secreting? What are the testes secreting? It was around the time that we then isolated testosterone in the 1930s. And our focus, both from a scientific perspective, but also pushed by consumers, was what can we do with these male hormones? What could testicles do? Do we need extra ones from animals? So at the same time when there were doctors and scientists navigating, I think a lot of their research then was how can we distinguish what makes a man and what makes a woman? So these sex hormones then became estrogen equals woman, testosterone equals male, and in some ways made a divide that we learned quickly after doesn't exist, but that binary has stuck with us. And then again in the 1950s, I talk about the explosion of the use of human growth hormone from pituitary glands before we had synthetic. What drove it? It wasn't just doctors saying, I'm going to dump all this growth hormone on kids, but it was people reading magazines that said your short boys are doomed never to marry, never to get hired. They're going to have something, we coined the term inferiority complex, came out of this growth hormone and the potential that it could help young boys. So I think at each generation, we see this mix of what scientists are doing, what doctors believe in, but also how we're all swayed by the culture and what patients are demanding and what their fears are of the time.
And I think we all probably intuitively understand, I would submit from the historical moment we're living through today, something that you also show to be true kind of in medicine, which is that kind of in moments of uncertainty, particularly when we think about our health, or arguably even more potently our children's health, we're vulnerable to hucksters and fraudsters. And I think you do a tremendous job of kind of illuminating how that isn't something that only happened like in yesteryear. It's something that's happening today. Could you talk a little bit about why, particularly in the field of hormones, you think kind of the cons have been so successful?
Because we love certainty. I mean, everybody that's a doctor out there and anyone that's going to be a doctor soon knows that you're taught in medical school, nothing's 100% sure. Everything has side effects. Life has a side effect. Everything has a side effect. You can never say to a patient, I'm gonna make you happier, I'm gonna make you better. But, and this is what I learned from my research, I know how to be a really good charlatan, and I have advice for anyone out there. And you
this is not how I thought the answer to this question was going to go. I didn't think Randy's going to be
only have to work 9 to 5.
Let me tell you how to sell snake oil.
You only have
not
to
what
work,
I was anticipating.
Yeah, only work 9 to 5. You never take call. Don't take insurance, and you can charge a lot. But here's the trick.
You sell your soul.
Right. You have to be sure. You have to take someone by the hand and say, your doctors are too worried and with all these numbers and facts and data. I care about you. Don't listen to those reports that say 70% likely or this statistic. I'm going to tell you what to eat, what supplement to take, and don't worry, it's not a pharmaceutical scary drug. It's a really healthy supplement, and why you know it's so healthy? Because unlike the stuff that gets approved from the FDA that has to have a warning label in it, supplements don't have to have the warning label and have all those things. So actually, from your patient's point of view, if there's not a warning label that says side effects may include, the notion could be, oh, well, then it's 100% healthy. So I think we can't help but, it's like a human thing. We want control. And if you notice, the title is How They Control Us, not, people always say, you're going to tell us how we can control our hormones. Not yet, but maybe if we come back 50 years, we will. But people want surety, and they want someone to hold their hand and say, here's exactly what you have to do. So we can laugh about stuff that went on in the 1920s when men were told, you know, have a vasectomy, it's going to boost your libido. Ha, 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 I can't believe they fell for that. But you can click on Amazon, and don't do it now, because I'll feel bad if you start going on the internet now. But you can buy an oxytocin nasal spray for under $50, for $48. It could just be water, it could be air, but it is promoted to spray around yourself, and the person next to you will want to bond with you. So, you know, but it sounds funny, but if you go online, these things are being sold.
And when we were talking earlier today, though, you kind of had an update to the story of one of the doctors who has been promoting oxytocin as this kind of magical elixir to solve any and all challenges in one's life. And I will say, reading it, not only as someone who cares deeply about public health, but also as a mother, you know, the woman who Randy kind of orients the oxytocin chapter around, who is a OBGYN, has been experimenting on her own children. So not only did this clearly horrify me for all of the kind of evident reasons from a kind of a public health and a research integrity perspective, like, she clearly had sold the con to herself, which that is a pretty extraordinary dynamic. And yet, she may not be getting away with it. So, Randy, could you kind of give the update that you shared?
Yeah, the
with
update
me?
is, so in the book, I write about a health clinic that I visited, a woman who left her job as an OBGYN at UCLA and opened up a health clinic on Wilshire Boulevard. And you walk through her shop to get, it's beautiful. It looks like a spa. And you walk through her shop where she sells her own brand of adrenal booster, prostate booster, all these supplements in addition to oxytocin. Yeah, I think her oxytocin, which she gave me one, I think it was a piece of candy. It just tasted like sugar. I don't think anything got in me. But she took one, she gave me one, she gave her assistant one, she gave her publicist one. And then they all said, I feel like we're bonding. And she said, I do too. And we all huddled closer. And I didn't feel anything. But so I felt a little guilty making her look sort of silly in my chapter, though I did do a lot of research, and it did bother me that she is charging people a fortune for some of this cockamamie stuff and calling herself an endocrinologist just because she sells hormone supplements. But I felt justified a few days ago. Actually, it was September 13th. She made it into People magazine for missing a uterine cancer, for having and she missed another cancer as well. She is right now not allowed to call herself an OBGYN. She's certainly not allowed to call herself an endocrinologist, because you can't if you've never been board certified or done endocrinology. Who knew? And she's basically she's on parole. She might have her license taken away. Now, her response, I thought that was bad enough. Like, if I were her, which I wouldn't be her, but if I were her, I would have gone on vacation or just let this fade away. But she actually had a rebuttal, which I didn't tell you about when we were talking. Her rebuttal was basically, I am offering patients things that the medical community doesn't appreciate yet. I represent the future of medicine, and so many of my patients have done well. So she's just digging in and standing her ground for, and I think she has a lot of believers out there. Like, don't believe established medicine, they're too slow. They're just so stuck on this evidence-based stuff. But I've got a big business, and a lot of my patients love me. Suzanne Summers, Sarah Ferguson, she's got a lot of testimonies. And as we know now and then, and as doctors practicing, testimonials really sway public perception.
You know, one of the, I think, heartening elements of that story is that there is some accountability, maybe too late, arguably, but there is some accountability. And yet your book is full of kind of stories of accountability that came kind of decades after the fact. And when you first started working on this, I was so struck a few years ago when we were having our conversation by how much kind of you were teaching me around the story of human growth hormone, and also how much you were teaching me around kind of the science of fertility, which was a kind of outgrowth of your book, Get Me Out, one of the great titles ever of a book. And so I wonder if, Randy, you could just share a little bit about what surprised you the most in writing this book and kind of what you learned the most from in writing Aroused.
Well, a few things. One of the things, I don't know if I want to say surprised. No, I will say surprised. The power of the individual person to do something. So not just doctors. I mean, there's some amazing scientists. I don't just write about cockamamie stuff. I write, and someone asked me if I intentionally sought after female scientists that did wonderful things. I didn't intentionally do it, but probably on some subconscious thing. I read about them, and I'm like, you need a voice, like you need to be known. So I do highlight some amazing female scientists, especially in the 1930s and 40s, that had to really work hard to get their name be heard. But that wasn't surprising. One of the stories that surprised me was a mom in Long Island who was told that her son needed growth hormone. I won't get into all the details because I could go on forever about this story, but it was the 1960s where people were worried about, can we use this new growth hormone because my son might be way too short. It was just isolated. This woman brought her son to the doctor and she said, you know, we've tried thyroid, which was tried for short kids, and this doctor said other people will give him testosterone. I'm not going to try that because it doesn't work. But we could try growth hormone. It was from pituitaries then. We didn't have synthetic. We could try growth hormone, and the mom was like, sure, you know, we'll try this. And she said, but you're going to have to collect your own. You're going to have, if you can bring me pituitaries, and I now know Barbara Balaban, this mom, who she thinks now in retrospect the doctor was, instead of just saying, forget about it, we can't help you, the doctor was more like, you get your own pituitaries, we can isolate the growth hormone and treat your son. Barbara Balaban was she was a mom in Long Island who within 3 months became one of the nation's leading collectors of pituitary glands, third only to the VA and the NIH. And I spoke to Dr. Bob Blizzard, who was on the medical side collecting them, and he did say we were going around asking people to donate pituitary glands, pathologists, and they would say, sorry, we've already promised Balaban. Sorry, we've already promised Balaban. And he was like, what's a Balaban? And he ended up at her door in Great Neck, Long Island, saying, like, who are you? And she kept them in nail polish remover, acetone, in jars in her laundry room. And eventually she joined forces because Bob Blizzard, who died recently and was a leading figure in pediatric endocrinology, saw right away that he did not want growth hormone only to be available to those either with the moxie or the money to get it. So he asked her to join forces and said, we'll always have enough for your son as long as we share it so that it could be shared evenly. So she did. So then she became part of this government task force. But it's amazing to me what one woman can just do. She felt she needed to treat her son. I think a lot of moms probably would have felt the same way. Her trick, if anyone wants to know, and my mom in the audience will love this, she said the reason why she became one of the leading national pituitary gland collectors is she wrote a handwritten thank you note to every single person that gave her a pituitary. So that'll be one takeaway lesson, handwritten thank you notes.
I love handwritten thank you notes. So I'm going to take away that Randy can teach you how to be a charlatan and that I need to teach my children how to write handwritten thank you notes. Two of my marquee takeaways from today. Randy, one of the things that kind of you alluded to earlier, but I know you feel kind of passionately about kind of bringing more kind of into the light, is how gender was constructed at a particular moment in time. And arguably we've been kind of dealing with the consequences of that kind of since then and are still trying to kind of move away from kind of this one decision that was made, a handful of decades ago. Could you talk a bit about kind of why there was that decision to kind of codify gender as this idea and what the consequences have been?
Yeah, I go back to, we think now transgender, people who have a transgender identity, and I do write about that, but really the concept of gender, it really was only used in grammar up until the 1950s. And then at Johns Hopkins, there was someone named John Money, a very controversial figure, but he was the one that said, it's not just whether you have an ovary or testes, it's not just XX or XY, it's your identity, which is made up of a whole, how you consider yourself, what your chromosomes are, what your gonads are, and he actually coined this term gender to be used. So it was something that we think of as always been around, but before then we said, what's your sex, not what's your gender. And again, I've reached out to a lot of people in the intersex community, people in the transgender community. Some of them, I think, felt that I wasn't angry enough in my chapter of intersex that I write, because I don't 100% blame the doctors for what they did. I don't think the doctors in the 1950s were out to say, how can we manipulate people and how can we make this decision that we don't care what's gonna happen. I think there was this strong feeling in the 1950s and 60s of these children will be better off looking clearly masculine or looking clearly what we think is feminine. I write about a woman in my book who was unfortunately born in 1956, right at that peak of learning what we thought about gender, and the theory then was that up until 18 months, gender was malleable. So you were born a blank slate, we weren't thinking prenatal influences, and that you had up until that 18-month cutoff to make a decision. All you had to do was like switch trucks to dolls and change pants to dresses. And this woman, what did happen with her was that she was born with ambiguous genitalia, but they said to the mom, you have a son, though he has abnormal genitalia, you have a son. Then there were some other issues. They brought him back to the doctor at 17 months, so before that cutoff. And then the doctor said, actually, we made a mistake. You have a daughter, so just sign here. And she showed me all her medical records on the form, and there's just one form that said, I agree to change Brian to Bonnie. Mom signed her name. Throw out all the pictures, get rid of his man clothes, put in girl clothes, dolls, and don't worry, it's before the 18-month cutoff. So as you can imagine, she had a very troubled upbringing. And now she's very involved in the intersex community, and she's very angry because in those days also she had surgery done right away. The doctor said, I'm gonna do exploratory surgery. He came out and said, we realized that she had an enlarged clitoris. We amputated all of it. We also realized that she's a hermaphrodite. She has some testes and ovaries, and they wrote that in her chart. The language has changed since then. And I think but again, I don't think these doctors were doing this because they were evil and trying to figure out we're gonna just freak these kids out. They were doing what they thought of the time, that let's try to make these kids feel normal. It was the 50s and 60s. You wanted to feel like a full woman or a full man, and you wanted to raise your kids that way. We are now realizing that this should not be emergency surgery. The surgery that was done is really considered cosmetic. It shouldn't be done anymore. Apparently it still is, but there is this voice going out to say, you can explain to parents slowly if your child is born with ambiguous genitalia. There's many syndromes. It's a big balloon umbrella term for many different ailments, and the doctor can explain to you exactly what it is, and no cosmetic surgery needs to be done right at birth. And there's an activist community, again, it's coming from the patients themselves that are figuring out the language. We talked a lot about language and words and the importance of words. They've driven this. They've driven the issue of we don't want to be called hermaphrodites. We want to be called intersex, or differences in sexual development. And again, this then sort of goes in, people who identify as transgender, that is very different. They weren't born with ambiguous genitalia, but they do feel, and they know down to the core that how they identify doesn't match their external genitalia. And again, these are issues now that doctors and experts are grappling with and trying to understand.
I was very moved though, reading that chapter in particular, the solidarity between the woman whose story is so painful to read as a parent, because I have no doubt that her parents thought they were doing the right thing for her in 1956, and when she had subsequent surgery also still as a child. But how she and others are really supporting parents today who also have intersex children, and that was a moment of hope, kind of in that otherwise quite depressing chapter.
Yeah, and I think Bo, she's been Brian, then Bonnie, and now calls herself Bo. She really was one of the founders of this movement. Accidentally, she read in the Sciences magazine, Dr. Fausto Sterling, who's an anthropologist or sociologist, but a very brilliant woman at Brown University, wrote an article from that point of view saying we shouldn't really have 2 genders, there should be 5 genders. It's in a short piece, and this was in, the 1993. And so she wrote highlighting, not really going into ambiguous genitalia, but just talking about there's a whole spectrum. Bo wrote a letter to the editor saying, I was born intersex. I think she used that term. I was born intersex, and actually I have a foundation or a organization for anybody that's like me. She didn't at the time. She just said, I have this organization for anyone that's like me that wants to reach out. She just felt that there's no way I could be the only one. And I think she gave her mailing address, her home address, and she thought that maybe she'd hear from 5 people and they could get together and have a meeting. It basically became a full-time job. She was flooded with letters saying, I thought I was the only one, I thought I was the only one. And that's how the intersex, there are other people too, and she doesn't like when I give her full credit, but a lot of people do give her full credit, but she's one of the patients that really got this whole groundswell going.
And Randy, it's not only the doctors kind of in that chapter, but often you recognize, I think, with real kind of humanity, not abrogating kind of responsibility away from them, but real humanity, how often kind of doctors and other researchers are doing the best they can with what they know and what they believe to be true.
Absolutely.
Even if sometimes kind of they go sideways or backwards from a scientific perspective.
So you want me to tell the Steinac story?
I do. Yeah,
Okay.
That was my effort to segue into that because I know you wanted to talk about it.
Right. So, one of the points in the book is that we can't just say, okay, these are the bad guys and these are the good guys. There's a gray area in between. And one of the things that I think we all know is that some of our leading scientists are the ones that see the data and then make a leap. So Cushing, for instance, saw the data. He could barely see in the pituitary then. We didn't have the sophisticated imagery, but he had this idea that the pituitary gland probably affects the body. There were people that really thought he was nuts at the time, but he was right. So he took this leap, and now he could say that's wonderful. But sometimes people leap in the wrong direction. So that's the story I want to talk about. And they're not always bad guys. They're brilliant, but they just happen to do a lot of brilliant things and then some not so brilliant. Even Cushing himself did the first pituitary transplant, and I'll just tell this little story too. So he did all these wonderful things, and now everyone believed his mind-body theories, and he's famous. And he had a man with a pituitary tumor. He was 48 years old. He was complaining, vision, headaches. And then Cushing thought, well, because he was a very daring, bold surgeon, what if I take out his pituitary and just give him a fresh one from a baby that was born, like a stillborn baby? So it was before the days of IRBs and all that. He just said he called a friend who was an OBGYN and said, if you get a stillborn, can I have the pituitary? And I'm going to send a medical student over to get it. He did the surgery. He didn't want to be secret about it. It went right to the press. Baby brain cures man. Broken brain cured by baby. And Cushing thought that worked. But, of course, the man then had this non-functioning pituitary. So after a month or so, symptoms came back. He wasn't feeling well. Cushing did it again because he still thought he was on the right path. Same medical student, same doctor. And this time the man eventually died. Cushing, who was a great surgeon, artist, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, didn't like to admit his mistakes, shocking. So what he said was he was nearing the end of his career and did not try to do this again, but he blamed the medical student for not going fast enough to get the pituitary and bring it back, and he blamed the OBGYN for not dissecting it properly, but he didn't try it again. So he made a mistake. The story that I'm slowly getting to is Eugene Steinach, who was a scientist in Vienna who did Nobel Prize-winning research. If anyone's heard his name now, it's because we think he was the one that started the whole 1920s vasectomies boost libido. And he never did the operations, but he promoted that theory. But he wasn't a charlatan quack trying to get his surgeon friends a lot of money from doing worthless vasectomies to boost libido. His original research was saying that the interstitial cell produced male hormone. Testosterone wasn't made yet. I love the story in a few ways because he was right about that. Many of his colleagues nominated him 11 times for the Nobel Prize. He didn't get the Nobel Prize because, as we know, all prizes are kind of subjective. A lot of people on the Nobel Committee at that time in the 1920s could not believe that the interstitial cell did anything. They just thought it was connective tissue. So that I've just recently read was the main reason he didn't get the Nobel Prize. But then he had a theory that sounds good, it's just not right, that if you kill off cells in an area or block them, the other ones will proliferate, kind of like weeds. So that got him thinking, oh, well, then if you block something near the interstitial cell, a vasectomy would do that. That'll make more interstitial cells. Then we'll have more of whatever this male hormone is, and that'll make people smarter and better libido and more wonderful, whatever he thought all those male characteristics were. So he tested it on rats, and he said he saw they became eroticized, which my copy editor said isn't a word, and I'm like, but he used it. He actually coined the term erotization, and that's what his rats became. And then they tested it in a man. He didn't, a colleague did. And we all know the power of testimony. The doctor said, I want you to now see if you have a stronger libido, because we think this is going to make your libido better, and you should feel closer to your 20-year-old self. And sure enough, he did. Freud had it done. He said he felt better. Yeats had it done and said even his poetry is better than it's ever been. Steinach, the concept of vasectomies for libido became so popular here in America that Steinach's name became a verb. So people were getting Steinached all over. There were doctors saying this doesn't make sense, this is testimony, but as you know, testimony held sway. And it didn't fade because doctors finally convinced people, I think this is placebo. It swayed because we isolated testosterone and you didn't have to have the vasectomy. You could just one day get testosterone gel.
Well, and Randy tells the story of a man in London who had it done and rented the Royal Albert Hall to kind of prove his virility. He was going to stand on stage and let people ask him questions forever and ever, and he had a heart attack and died the night before. Oh, yes. Hopefully he lived a good, robust life until then. So I want to open it up to questions. I know we have roving mics. I think we'll take audience questions for about 20 or so minutes, and then I want to ask Randy a concluding question. And if none of you raise your hands, although you don't strike me as a retiring audience, but if no one raises your hands, I'm happy to keep asking questions. So with that preamble, thoughts, questions, comments for Randy? No?
No?
Yes. It's okay, we can hear you too. I can repeat the question.
We'll repeat the question in case.
In your opinion, what exactly is it that makes people liable to sort of be vulnerable to these sort of charlatans or to sort of these fads? Like right now you look at, for example, what's her name? Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop, right? Why do people sort of go for that? But equally, why do people feel distrustful of the medical community in general? What makes them sort of go in that direction?
Okay, so the question was, for anyone that didn't hear it, why do people gravitate to Goop over than their family practitioner? And why are people distrustful of medicine? And I do think it goes back to we're trained as physicians to explain the pros and cons of everything. And there's this damn uncertainty that people don't want to hear about. And so things like Goop, I think there's a number of reasons. One, there's surety, even though it's fake, there's surety in it. And there's testimonies. And there's some, and you know, it's interesting because people will say, oh, I don't believe what I read. They do believe what's in the media. And I also think that as doctors, it's important to keep up with what's going on and what your patients are hearing rather than just dismiss it outright, because your patients want you to have an open mind. So rather than say, which you just want to say and I'd want to say, like, oh, that's from Goop. It's ridiculous. Don't go there. I think we have this history sometimes of doctors, and I'd probably be the same way, that you just get so annoyed and angry that someone would do that, and you just want to say, honestly, don't do that. Here's what you're supposed to do. It might be better not take an hour, but a few moments just to say, I get it. I know where you're coming from. I know you think that you're tired because you have adrenal fatigue syndrome, but can I just explain to you, I know this is where this is coming from, but here's what I'm worried about if you do that, and here's what I think can help. And I think so much of it sounds so trite, but so much of it does come down to doctor-patient relationships and just taking those, I mean, that didn't take me that long to say that. Just taking that, you know, because everyone complains, I don't have an hour, but it doesn't take an hour just to be a little open-minded. And also I do think, like, flip through, you don't have to buy it, but flip through some of these magazines, go on the website, see what's out there. I not only think it's good to know what's out there, but it will explain your patient's fears. Because I think what's being sold, some of those people, they're really savvy about knowing what people are afraid of. Old age, loss of libido, I don't know, gray hair, whatever, you know, but I think sometimes we don't realize what our patients, your patients, I don't have any, you don't realize what your patients are afraid of. And so it's good to keep an open mind to be reading that just so that you know where these market forces are.
And Randy and I think, first bonded over our distress about the anti-vaccine movement, which is another kind of iteration of the same challenge. And as I have said before, I'm really not a vindictive person at all, which is probably healthy for me in my life. The only person really that I have a real vendetta against is Andrew Wakefield. Like, there's a special place in hell for him. And I say that because he has and continues to be a destructive force, and I keep telling my friends in England, I'm like, can't you just take him back? Like, we don't want him here in the United States any longer. But I think that he is sadly the archetype of this, of the predation on fear, on the appeal to kind of in a parent's best instincts in the kind of worst and most malfeasant ways. Other questions in the white coat with the...
In the white coat.
Sorry, I don't know anybody's name. I realize it's also not very particular, but
Thank you.
I
That was
had my pen to awkwardly point in your direction.
a really wonderful presentation so far. My name's Tara Sampt. I'm one of the oncologists here. And sort of along the lines of the gentleman before me, you know, in cancer care, something like 85% of our patients take supplements, and we either don't ask or they don't tell us, but they're doing it anyway. So I'm just curious about your thoughts of how we might be able to take it even a step further, not just being aware of it or asking about it, but should we embrace, you know, some of these integrative and supplemental practices to first do no harm, but maybe house some of these services within cancer centers so that patients have a place to come to talk to people about alternative and complementary treatments. I should say complementary, not alternative, but you know, we're sort of on the verge of some of that here, and I know other cancer centers are doing it. And if we don't do it, I feel like they are just gonna go out to these private boutiques where they pay a lot of money to take a lot of supplements that could do harm. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts on what our role is in the medical profession to address some of it and maybe embrace some of it.
I do think it's a good idea to embrace some of some of the things of like yoga and massage and meditation. And I know that there are centers that will tell patients, we don't know if this is going to make you live longer, and it doesn't mean you weren't meditating the right way if it doesn't help. But we do know it can help make you feel better along the way. And I do think that shows patients that you do have this open mind. But yeah, and I do think that it allows them then to maybe open up and shows that you're more open-minded to tell you about their supplements. I mean, I was in the gym the other day and I heard, like, it looked like a 20-year-old trainer telling someone, here's the supplements I'd like you to take. He was talking to like a 60-year-old man. And I was like, do I get into this? Do I inject myself? And I could hear my girls saying, even though they weren't there, no, stay out of it, stay out of it. But fortunately, as he listed all the supplements that this guy should buy, the response, right as I was about to interrupt, he said, you know, I've had a history of the patient or the guy working out. I've had a history of kidney stones. My doctors told me that, you know, if anyone ever recommends a supplement, to really check it out with him. So if you can write them down, and I'm going to bring it back to my doctor just so he knows, because it was really painful, those kidney stones, and I don't want to do anything. So I thought, okay, and I didn't interrupt. I didn't even join the conversation. But yeah, I do think what you're saying, like rather than say we're not going to do any of that here because it's not going to make you live longer, to show that you're open to these suggestions, and that if this makes the journey easier for you, but we don't want you spending your money or doing something that can interact. I think one of the things that people don't understand is that they feel like, and I always try to say to people, if you think it's potent enough to do good, it's got to be potent enough to have a side effect. For some reason, they get that chemo can do good things and bad things, but supplements can only do the good thing. And some might be doing a good thing, but they also might be doing, I mean, you know this, I'm telling this to you, but I do think, yeah, it's that we should have complementary medicine available.
Okay, great. Other questions? Any questions in the balcony? No.
I think there was one.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Molly Dornberg. I'm a student at the School of Public Health. I am wondering how you think about and how you address in your book the relative, I guess I would say, lack of intersectionality in this history in terms of like race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, etc.
In terms of medical history, you mean?
In terms of how and whether at all this history applies to people who are non-affluent and non-white.
I think there's been, I mean, I just look at the history, not trying to change things, but I think, yeah, this comes up a lot in what I write and what I've looked at both in childbirth and in hormone therapy. We know when the birth control pill first came out, it was mainly white women that can afford it. And then there were fears then that it was being pushed on people on sterilization that didn't want it. So we have this mixed history. And that, again, it's interesting. Like Barbara Balaban, for instance, the one that that was the big growth hormone collector. She's a white woman from Long Island. And she had told me that her doctor was just kind of nasty to her. And actually, I gave a talk here about that chapter a while ago, and someone came up to me and said, no, actually, she wasn't a nasty doctor. But the doctor that Barbara Balaban went to had such a concern to make sure that hormones were divvied up evenly that I think she was annoyed that this one patient was able to do so well on her own. So they had this contentious relationship. But I do think, yes, there's been a whole history of certain types of medicine that are only available to those that can afford it. And it's not just who can afford it, but also who has the agency to say to their doctor. I mean, my last book was on history of childbirth, and it was always sort of the women that felt they could speak up to doctors to say, no, 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 you're not doing that to me, or yes, you can. So it's this, yes, I see what you're saying, and it's this long history, not just of money, but of race, but also socioeconomic. And a lot of that informs how much power a person feels they have to speak back to their physician.
And you do touch on that a little bit in your eugenics
Yeah.
discussion. Oh gosh, yes. Yeah, long hair. I'm sorry. White coat, long hair.
Hi, I'm a student also in the School of Public Health. From my understanding, in like the study of medicine, one of the other issues is the consideration of maleness, whatever that means to be the default. So not just like
hopefully we're getting away from that. Yeah, and it was like, okay, anti-Müllerian hormone, even in the beginning, because we all look alike in the very beginning when you're in that little croissant stage of fetal life. And then it's when anti-Müllerian hormone kicks in that you either choose one fork or the other. And yes, there has been, some of the quotes are just amazing in terms of anything that we've put towards a man and testosterone, which means more, stronger, more career-oriented. There was a quote that I have in my book, even from when estrogen and testosterone were first isolated, and we thought, okay, what can we do? Who needs this? Who doesn't? And one of the doctors said, we have to be careful because soon enough, women will think that they're ambitious enough to have careers. I don't think he was kidding. And then someone said, the response was, this goes back to the 20s where we called feminist suffragettes, but could we turn those suffragettes back into maternal housekeepers again? I think that hopefully we're getting away from that, but it is something still ingrained. A colleague of mine is writing a book just on testosterone, and she calls it the aspirational hormone. She's done a lot of work with gender issues and the Olympics. That's her expertise, not mine. But we still think that these women that have slightly higher testosterone, that's what's making them run faster and do better. And we know that from her studies and what she's looked into, that it doesn't always, some of these women have lost. Some of these women, even with the little extra testosterone that they were born with, not doping, hasn't had the impact that we think. But it's ingrained. We're trying to get away from that, but it's very ingrained in our system.
Yes.
Incredible presentation today. Thank you. So my question is basically about the size, about the charlatan industry, and do you think that it's grown over the past decade, and could this relate to perhaps growing distrust of the medical institution, or even people unable to afford health insurance? Do you think that these factors potentially played a role?
I think it's the people that have the money that can keep the charlatan businesses going. Those that can't afford insurance and those that can't afford medicine cannot afford these people, and they're not giving out their stuff for free. I think it's so easy to say, oh my God, it's worse now than ever, but if you look back in history, the 1920s, they would say it's worse now than ever. Every generation, you think it's worse now than ever, so I kind of think we have these pushes and pulls. And I do think when people are distrustful of the medical establishment for whatever reason, it drives people to seek help elsewhere. Is the testosterone industry booming right now? I got on the Metro North yesterday, right to a poster that said are you feeling fatigued? It had all men, it didn't say this, but basically it was all men over the age of 30 could use testosterone. Call this clinic. We're right near a Metro North station. So that's a huge industry now, but I think it might have been even more in the 1920s when there was no one really clamping down. But I think there's always going to be someone out there to get that low-lying fruit and see, oh wait, we just learned that oxytocin has something to do with social skills. I'll put that in a bottle and sell it. There's always someone that's clever enough to figure out.
Okay, one last question, because you've been very patient in the blue. And, yeah, sorry. So I'm sorry we didn't get into the other hands, but yes.
Very much for being here. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the School of Medicine, and I had a question you might comment. So it's fashioned and stated that we live in this post-truth world where we may not value evidence and facts and rationale as we once did. I wonder, in your research of the evolution of American culture from the 1920s to the present day, you might comment on the evolution of the value of evidence and rationale and what that looks like, maybe even the world of social media and so forth.
Yeah, I think the world of the internet and social media has really changed it, just because in terms of these new fads can just go viral, if that's what we call it, much faster. And I think it's just hard to push back against testimony. And I think, yeah, it's always been there, but I don't think you could create that wave as quickly as you can now in terms of treatments and drugs that are thought to save your life. And as much as people will say they don't believe it, they do. And that's the hard thing. What can we do? You know, we can clamp down on doctors like my oxytocin salesperson. It's very hard to clamp down on people posting stuff or misconstruing. A lot of it isn't just from nowhere. It's people misconstruing what's in the media. And then, you know, it's almost like the game of telephone, and we're constantly working against that. And again, it's freedom of the press, so how do you clamp down on all this? And I think, yeah, it gets back to basic cause and effect too. I mean, the whole thing with vaccines, or people were saying, no, my kid had a vaccine, and then 2 years later was diagnosed with autism. There's a fact. There's, you know, so it's not just like these things out of nowhere. It's the way they see the data too.
Or that measles isn't so bad for you.
Right.
I want to end on an optimistic note, hopefully. Randy, the first story that she shares in her book is about a woman named Blanche Gray who had the horrific name, I guess, of being the fat bride in the early 20th century. And yet she says, you know, she was born on the wrong side of medical discovery, that had she been born later, there would have been clear interventions to help kind of save her life, improve her life. Hopefully also she would have been born at a time when kind of bullying was not an acceptable form of communication. And so I want to ask Randy, like, what are we on the other side of now? What do you think that in kind of the study of hormones or otherwise, you know, for your crystal ball, what do you see kind of coming down the pike?
What I think is really exciting now, and I can say to this Yale audience, because I start with Cushing, who was at Yale, and then I just spoke to a wonderful researcher right here, Sabrina Diano, who's doing now some of the cutting edge neuroscience endocrine work. I think what's really on the cutting edge now is hormones and behavior. So a few decades ago, we realized that the fat cell isn't just a glob of butter that I thought it was. It's actually an endocrine cell that secretes hormones. But when we learned that leptin is our appetite suppressing hormone, you can't take it, you're not going to lose weight from it, but even though there are leptin diet books out there. But what the fascinating part isn't that people that have leptin defects gain weight more quickly. It doesn't affect their metabolism. It drives them to eat. They're compelled to eat. And people with leptin defects that eat all the time, it's not like they're enjoying their food. It's just this compulsion. So when I spoke to the scientists that are doing that research or that isolated that gene, their feeling was, they're not just excited about what can we learn about obesity, but this is about behavior. This is showing us that hormones are controlling our behavior, not just growth and metabolism. Can we control our behavior with hormones? Do we understand the criminal mind? No, but I mentioned Sabrina Diano because she's doing fascinating work with leptin and looking at the inside the cell, not just receptors, but I think we're really honing in on the details of the cell to really understand behavior. We're not there yet. And will we control it? That's always that really weird question of how much control do we want to have.
So the more we know, I guess.
And we're on the verge. We've got great technology, and even though I make fun of some wacky scientists, there's some really wonderful ones and great research going on now.
So since we are in an educational institution, hopefully kind of we're in the presence of more wonderful than wacky scientists. Although kind of hopefully a little bit of wacky, as you also show in terms of kind of being able to imagine the previously unimaginable, is also a crucial part of driving us forward. I'm so thankful to Randy for her commitment to taking kind of conversations that often only happen in institutions like this kind of out into the broader public, because I think that kind of her and others' ability to do that is a crucial part of trying to ameliorate the distrust that so many of you ask questions about, and try to once again orient us around a shared fact base, which hopefully kind of people who aren't as acquainted with what a leptin is or isn't could still use to empower themselves to make the best decisions for themselves, their children, their futures, because we're all better off when that happens. So Randy, just thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Yale, for hosting us today. Thank you.